So we all know that the problem is that right now, there are no costs with, or not even any limits with emitting carbon, right? So putting a price on carbon is at the centerpiece of a lot of national proposals and legislation on climate change. So we've got various ways to price carbon. And I think, Peter, you'll be talking about some of them as well. So I'll just kind of run through them really quickly. Carbon taxes, carbon fees, cap and trade. I'll go into some of these a little bit, but leave most of it for Peter. So cap and trade is the leading climate change proposal that is being debated in Congress right now, or will be, hopefully, sometime by the Senate. And it's definitely part of California's AB 32 as well. So the theory of change, right, why carbon pricing will work via a cap and trade system is this, that by setting an overall cap, but allowing industry the flexibility of who, how, and when to make reductions, that's the trade part, the market will ferret out the cheapest reductions first. So emitters will always be asking themselves, okay, is it cheaper for me to make the reductions, or is it cheaper for me to buy my way out of them by just buying more permits? So some companies will say, well, it's actually cheaper for me to make the reductions, I'll make them. And others will say, well, it's getting pretty difficult for me to make reductions cost effectively, so I'll just buy more permits. And according to the efficient markets theory, the going price of these permits will be what's called the marginal cost of abatement of a ton of carbon given whatever cap we are at the time. So in other words, however much it costs the most efficient entity at the time to make a greenhouse gas reduction, that's what the price of carbon will be, in theory. So the question is, how much does carbon have to be priced at in order to get to, let's say, 80% reductions by 2050? Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is a well-known chart that was prepared by McKinsey, the consulting company. The most arresting thing about this chart, okay, it shows the cost of abatement on the y-axis and gigatons of greenhouse gas reductions on the x-axis. And the most arresting thing about this chart is that apparently, according to the study, emitters can make over 1 gigaton of reductions, about a third of our greenhouse gas goal, and come out financially ahead. It doesn't mean that these are free emission reductions or anything, but the savings that you get in the long term by making these greenhouse gas investments pay for themselves. So according to the chart, for example, if carbon had a cost of, let's say, $30, then it would make distributed PV solar pay for itself. At $60 a ton, coal plants would switch to natural gas, and that would pay for itself. And stuff like converting the US auto fleet to hybrids, well, that's really expensive and would only pay for itself if carbon was at $90 a ton. But as I said, there's lots of ways to price carbon. So one thing that we should keep in mind, though, is that it's important to put a price on carbon, at least in Friends of the Earth's opinion, but we shouldn't get carried away with it. And this is why. Carbon prices won't be enough if we want to get the incentives and the financing lined up in the right direction so that it's actually profitable to make timely, quick, just, and a radical, actually, transformation to a clean carbon economy. And here's three reasons why prices alone won't do it. First, putting a price on carbon may make being dirty more expensive, but it won't necessarily make being clean cheaper. Obviously, in a relative sense, it will, but not on an absolute sense. And this is really important because we need new technologies to take hold in a rapid manner and to scale. And that means making the clean stuff cheap, not just making the dirty stuff expensive. And this is particularly important as we think about the issue of, oops, wrong button. Okay. Phew, all right. This is especially important as we think of the issue of energy poverty, right? This picture here is a picture of students in Guinea studying under the lights of an airport because they can't study at home. There's no electricity. So over 1 trillion people in the world, right, don't have access to basic energy needs. We need to make clean energy cheap. And that means different strategies in addition to price and carbon. It means sustained public investments in R&D, massive public investments in price supports for clean energy. In the US, for example, the US could consider a feed-in tariff, which guarantees long-term contracts and prices for renewables. So, second, putting a price on carbon may incentivize the cheapest and the easiest reductions first, but it may actually end up delaying costlier and yet immensely important breakthrough investments that we need to transition to a clean energy economy. Now, Bill Gates recently wrote in an op-ed about the importance of making public investments to make this transition to a zero carbon economy. And he also commented on his own wealth and how he got so wealthy. And he said, no one accumulates a fortune without the help of our society's investments in infrastructure, in public universities, et cetera. So the idea that we can just make the market solve everything is, I think, a bit misguided. The idea that the private sector, such as entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, the idea that they did it on themselves without the help of government is kind of like a person who was born on third base and thought they hit a triple. Yeah? So the political reality here is that, it's not like our treasuries, our public coffers are really full. In order to mobilize this investment, we need to create fiscal space, so to speak, by doing things like cutting the fossil fuel subsidies to the wrong polluting industries, closing tax loopholes for polluters, and if we price carbon, making sure that some of that money raised actually goes into these public investments. So nothing creates, though, political intractability as much as entitlements. And when polluters have entitlements, like the royalty relief or like tax breaks, you create vested interests that are very dedicated to making pollution as cheap as possible. So the next point is that pricing carbon, although it's really important in the suite of policy options, has been so emphasized that it's almost detrimental to other strategies to mitigate and manage carbon and to drive investment in clean technologies. We need to think of other things like public mandates and just plain old regulation, actually, that can drive investment and innovation. So think, for example, about the Renewable Fuel Standard or the Renewable Portfolio Standards. I mean, these mandates have actually created a somewhat, in Friends of the Earth's perspective, kind of reckless boom in biofuels, especially in corn ethanol. It spurred mountains of investment in the sector. So the mandate was established, investment followed. Think also maybe about the Montreal Protocol, which banned ozone-depleting chemicals. This prompted companies to come up with alternatives to develop non-CFC substitutes for most applications. So today, for example, if you buy an asthma inhaler, it will be propelled with a non-CFC pollutant. Now, of course, industry groused when this mandate was imposed, but the mandate was established and innovation followed. Or think about performance standards, just plain old regulations and standards that have been proven to work. For example, our efficiency standards for washers and refrigerators and things like that. So if we just put a price on carbon and ignore or disregard the role of regulations, I think it can be misguided, and it can also have some serious local impacts in the context of climate change. And here's what I mean. I live in Richmond, which is why I drove here alone in a car, and I will have to pay $5 for my ticket if I want to. I live in Richmond. It's home, as you know, to the West Coast's largest refinery operation, which is a significant emitter of not only carbon, but carbon co-pollutants like mercury. So unsurprisingly, cancer rates, asthma rates are pretty high. And the refinery is already causing communities to bear an unacceptably high toxic load. So what would putting a price on carbon do? Yes, it would probably make it more expensive to operate the Richmond refinery, but it could also mean that the toxic burden that is already borne by this community would continue or maybe even increase if the company decides, hey, we should just continue paying to pollute. So Richmond residents are demanding straight-up regulations which say no more pollution here. Chevron shouldn't have to pay to pollute more. They should just stop polluting more, right? And I should note that right now in Washington, there is really a battle heating up between carbon prices as a strategy to mitigate greenhouse gases versus regulation. So the draft climate bill that Kerry released yesterday takes away the ability of the EPA to use the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon emissions. Now, you remember that the EPA made a determination that carbon emissions are a pollutant which poses a danger to public health and the environment. And so the EPA would be compelled to create regulations to limit the emission of CO2. But as you know, the realpolitik of the situation in Washington is if we want a climate bill that has cap and trade, you have to give up the Clean Air Act, you have to give up regulations. So this tension between regulations versus carbon pricing, we probably need both, but not one at the expense of the other. So finally, I'll end on a positive note, and that is, it's good to be a Californian, for now, at least. I am talking about our embattled AB 32 law. So legislators, as you know, set a greenhouse gas cap, and they asked ARB to figure out, well, how do we get there? So ARB did the math and figured out that by, for example, instituting the Pavley law on cars, we get 31 million tons of emissions. By implementing that Million Solar Roofs initiatives, that's another 2 million tons. Energy efficiency standards, that's another 26 million tons. Light-speed rail, another 1 million tons of reductions. And when they finally stood back and actually added up all of the reductions, these so-called complementary strategies were really foundational strategies, right? In kind of DC policy wonk speak, all of these other strategies are considered complementary, and price and carbon is considered the core thing. So they found that all of these complementary strategies actually could actually end up getting us 75 or 80% of the way towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And the extra 25% of reductions that we would need to get, that would be addressed by price and carbon through a cap and trade system. And in fact, the Markets Advisory Committee on AB 32 said that participating in a carbon trading system should not excuse facilities from all the other standards and mandates that they have to follow. In fact, by following all those other standards and mandates, it should actually help them meet their cap and make it more affordable to them because they don't have to buy so many carbon permits. So I think that California actually has gotten it right. We've realized that transitioning to a low-carbon economy will take mandates, like a cap, as well as performance standards, as well as public investments, as well as putting a price on carbon. And I think, and I hope, that the rest of the country will follow suit. Thank you.